Geographic.
Greetings, lovers of lore. Thank you for joining me for this Genesis lore. Today, we're going to be talking about Idris the Flame Mage, specifically her crazy origin story. So Idris was raised by her blacksmith father. Unfortunately, her mother had died when she was just a baby. And as a result, she spent most of her time in the smithy, working there with her father for years as she grew up. She was fascinated by flames, from the tiniest flicker to the biggest fire. She found it to be completely entrancing. So she was naturally drawn to learning to work the bellows, to feed the fire, so she could watch it grow. And while she was watching it, nothing else existed. And this continued on for quite some time, until one fateful day, her father placed the iron in the fire as usual, and Idris made the fires jump as usual, except this time it was different. The flames moved because she willed them to. She realized she had not used her hands to move the bellows, and yet the fires grew higher. And as she stared intently into them, her irises shifted from gray into twin blazing spheres of crimson with flickers of orange. She felt absolutely incredible. Up until this point, she had always been separate from the fire, but now they were twinned. She swayed and spiked the flames, delighting in her new abilities, experiencing the heart of the fire. It was absolutely intoxicating. Idris lost herself in the joy of immolation until she was abruptly startled out of it by a rough shake. Idris! It was her father. Concern was etched on his face. Are you okay? Did the fire harm you? You almost burnt the smithy down. But her father was a good man, and ultimately he took her new power in stride. But he cautioned her, you must keep this hidden. So Idris spent most of her time at the smithy. The firelight was very useful for hiding the change to her eyes. And she kept this secret from all the people she met until the day she got married. And she explained her powers to her husband, who took it in stride just like her father did. But at the same time, she also secretly confided in her husband's sister, because deep down underneath, Idris really wanted to use her powers to help people, so she told that one other person. But other than that, she settled down to start a family and live a happy life with her new husband. And she was succeeding admirably. They had a beautiful daughter, and things went quite well until one night a disaster broke out in town. The alarm bells started to peal, and Idris's husband left to help. Idris stayed home to protect her daughter, but she longed to be out making a difference because she could sense that it was a fire across town. In fact, she realized she could do something from where she was, so she reached out to the fire to bring it under control. But she was abruptly struck by something, rebuffed with such power that she sprawled on the floor. This had never happened to her before. Whenever she dealt with fire in the past, she was able to quell and control it in any way she desired. But this time, she could feel that the fire had hatred. It had a mind, and it was now aware of her, and she could feel its intent to destroy her. She had to move quickly, or the town would get burned down as this elemental came for her. So she decided, after a little bit of anguish, to leave her daughter asleep. Nobody else in town would be able to handle this situation. So after overcoming her hesitation and fear, she heads out into the smoke-filled streets trying to find her husband. But unfortunately, all the townsfolk give her contradictory directions. So she is bewildered. And then, Out of the smoke and ash looms the living fire. It had found her. And the town's alarm bell is pealing in the background. And she notices that it has the same rhythm, just like her father's hammer striking down on the anvil over and over. And inspired by him, she reaches out and she draws the flames out of the fireplaces of two nearby homes, whipping them up out of the chimneys and down into her palms. And then she wields them like two giant hammers, slamming them down into the fire elemental. Her reasoning is that fire on fire can work like metal would work on metal. The hammer of her father slamming down on the iron is the same as these hammers slamming down into the elemental. And I have to admit, I find this to be an amazing concept. Most of the time, you will see fire has no effect on other fire beings. So the idea of fire functioning akin to metal, where you can actually hammer slam it down, is a really amazing concept that I actually haven't seen anywhere else before. So she goes along with this logic and it works. She starts slamming down into the elemental, but it's not enough. So she starts to draw all these fires from other homes. Boom, 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 straight up the chimney. All the while, you have the rhythmic peal of the bell in the background as she slams these fires like hammers over and over into this elemental. And it is buckling under the blows, just like metal slamming on metal. She is not relenting in any way, to the point where this flurry of fiery hammer blows is taking the elemental down further and further. It keeps reforming, but it's trying to escape now. It's setting the town on fire as it flees, but Idris isn't giving it an inch. Hammer blow after hammer blow. The rhythm continues, and it doesn't stop until Idris realizes that the houses around her are collapsing. They've all burned down, and it was time to change tactics. Now, this pause gave the elemental courage. It foolishly thought that it had worn her down, and this caused it to stop fleeing. This worked to Idris's advantage, and she seized on the moment to gather all of the fire from all of the surrounding houses and all of the area around her and turned it into a giant wave that crushed in from all sides on the elemental. It had absolutely nowhere to go, and she closed her fist as the flame wave pulls in and almost completely annihilates the elemental. And the tiny little fragments of the elemental lay there broken, gasping for life on the ground. And Idris has a revelation that ultimately this little flame being is no different than some wild animal. And realizing that it doesn't have malice for her specifically, she started to feel bad for it. So she found a glass pendant and placed the broken elemental inside of it, using the surrounding fires to seal it shut into an amulet, and tied that around her neck. Now, the aftermath of that night was actually far worse than the fire. Hundreds and hundreds of people had died. Idris's husband was gone, and sadly, her daughter had been crushed in the house in her sleep. It got even worse for Idris because the townfolk talked about seeing her running around throwing fire everywhere. They couldn't sense the elemental like she could. And on top of that, her husband's sister damned her by saying she said she could control fire. She said she wanted to use her gift. And these were true statements, but it had also been twisted to give a different perspective. So Idris is trying to angrily explain, I was throwing fire because of this, holding up the amulet that had the broken elemental in it. But the townsfolk just look at her and go, she's crazy. She just admitted to doing all of this. And that's too much for Idris. She just gets overwhelmed, losing her family, trying to defend the town, and then having the town turn against her at the end causes her to just lose her will to live. And she falls to her knees. The townsfolk take this as a sign of guilt. They run in and not really realizing what they're doing. They grab her, tie her to a stake, and get ready to light up a big bonfire under her. Once they do so, they figure out what they've done wrong as Idris causes the flames to blast out, not destroying the townsfolk, just setting their clothes on fire and getting them to flee so she can free herself. Once she's freed, she's still completely broken inside. So she just starts to walk. She walks right out of town. She walks right out into the war-torn wastes. And there's nothing out there but old corpses. And after walking for a while, she was nothing but one too. Trudging along, her feet are bleeding. Her will to live is completely drained away to the point where she's not even blinking anymore. And she keeps walking until she collapses, waiting for the end. And speaking of ends, that's where we end off this part of the story. I have to admit, I absolutely loved the idea of fire being used as a weapon in the same vein as metal. It's such a cool concept that I haven't seen before, and it's actually what inspired me to do this Genesis lore specifically. So let me know what you think. If you enjoy what we're doing here, then you can support the channel by joining the channel membership or the Patreon. Thanks for coming by, my friends. Big thank you to all our patrons. And remember, lore is life.